Auschwitz was not born of chaos, but of cold calculation. It was engineered, brick by brick, order by order, to turn human life into ash. Behind its barbed wire, modern design, technology, and bureaucracy fused into a single machine of death. This was evil, not improvised, but engineered. More than 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. It was the deadliest extermination camp of the Holocaust, a place where cruelty wore the mask of efficiency. This documentary examines Auschwitz not only as a site of horror, but as a blueprint, engineered, perfected, and operated as the ultimate death factory. Chapter 1: The Blueprint of a Death Camp. When Rudolf Höss was appointed commandant of Auschwitz in April 1940, he did not inherit a finished camp. He was given rotting army barracks, abandoned horse stables, and a swampy stretch of Polish land. Yet, from this unimpressive foundation, he would oversee the creation of history's largest killing center. Höss had learned his trade in Dachau and Sachsenhausen, camps where brutality was systematic, where discipline and efficiency masked sadism. But at Auschwitz, his role was not simply to enforce rules, it was to design. Himmler wanted a model camp, a place that could embody Nazi ideology in concrete and barbed wire. At first, Auschwitz was meant for Polish political prisoners, a place to terrorize and control the occupied population. But as war expanded, so did its purpose. By 1941, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, Auschwitz became the chosen site for the final solution, the plan to annihilate European Jewry. Its location was no accident. The rail lines of Europe converged nearby, making Auschwitz accessible from every corner of the continent. The surrounding area was isolated, yet strategically connected. Industry loomed close. The IG Farben chemical plant would benefit from forced labor. The blueprint was simple: maximum exploitation of human bodies, followed by maximum destruction. From the beginning, Auschwitz was conceived not as a prison, but as an industrial complex. Prisoners would be housed in overcrowded barracks, worked to exhaustion, and then disposed of. The entire camp was a production line of death. In September 1940, Oswald Pohl of the SS Economic Administration inspected the site. His order was clear: exhument capacity. Within months, the camp stretched beyond its original barracks. Wooden watchtowers rose above electrified fences. Gates and rail spurs are installed with precision. Nothing was improvised. Auschwitz was designed to function like a machine. The next phase of engineering would be darker still. Chapter 2: Engineering Cruelty. Systems of Control. Killing on an industrial scale required more than buildings. It required systems, calculated methods of control that transformed individuals into numbers, into labor units, into expendable material. The Nazi engineers of Auschwitz created a hierarchy inside the camp itself. The Kapo system became one of its most sinister inventions. Selected prisoners were elevated to positions of authority over their peers. They supervised work details, enforced discipline, and reported infractions. Kapos who pleased the SS received better rations and privileges. Those who failed were beaten or sent back to the barracks to face the wrath of other prisoners, this structure turned victims against one another, dissolving solidarity and ensuring obedience. The tattooing system was another calculated measure. Unlike in other camps, Auschwitz marked prisoners permanently with numbers. At first stamped into chests, later on forearms, these tattoos erased names and identities. A prisoner was no longer a person. They were a code in a vast registry. This efficiency allowed the SS to track labor capacity while simultaneously dehumanizing their captives. Deception was engineered into every step. Deportees were told to bring valuables and clothing, to pack as if they were moving east for resettlement. Upon arrival, their possessions were cataloged with bureaucratic precision. Suitcases, shoes, and even hair were sorted for reuse. The lie was perfect. You are going to work, you are going to shower. By the time the truth was revealed, resistance was impossible. Even punishment was designed with calculation. In Block 11, the so-called death block, prisoners endured standing cells, tiny compartments where 4 men could not sit or lie down, forced to stand all night before working all day. Whippings, hangings, and starvation were not random acts of cruelty. They were integrated into the design, constant reminders that disobedience meant annihilation. The psychological effect was devastating. Prisoners lived in permanent uncertainty. Will I be chosen for work, for punishment, for death? The uncertainty itself became a weapon engineered to break the human spirit. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Death, Gas Chambers, and Crematoria. If Auschwitz was a machine, its engines were the gas chambers and crematoria. These were the ultimate engineering achievements of the Nazi death system. The first experiments took place in the basement of Block 11. In September 1941, Soviet prisoners of war were locked inside and gassed with Zyklon B, a cyanide pesticide commonly used to kill lice. The results were horrifying and efficient. Rudolf Höss reported back that this method could kill hundreds at once with minimal strain on SS personnel. From this experiment, the architecture of mass killing was designed. Birkenau, or Auschwitz II, was constructed specifically to house extermination facilities. Here, 4 massive crematoria were built, each containing gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Ventilation systems pumped in Zyklon B through ceiling vents. Within minutes, hundreds suffocated. Above these chambers, furnaces roared. Especially trained prisoner units, the Sonderkommando, dragged bodies from the chambers, pulled out gold teeth, cut hair, and loaded corpses into ovens. Each crematorium could burn thousands of bodies daily. If capacity was exceeded, open-air pits were dug where flames consumed the dead. The design was precise. Rail spurs led directly into Birkenau, allowing trains to unload passengers within sight of the gas chambers. Victims were selected on the ramp, separated into those fit for temporary labor and those sent immediately to death. Landscape paths and false signs reassured them they were heading to showers. Inside water pipes and shower heads added to the deception. This was architecture weaponized. Concrete, steel, and brick became tools not for shelter, but for annihilation. Efficiency was everything. Crematoria 2 and 3 at Birkenau could incinerate over 4,000 corpses each day. Records were kept, schedules were maintained. Death had become industrial. Auschwitz was not a breakdown of civilization. It was civilization's machinery used in service of barbarity. Chapter 4. Science Twisted, Doctors' Experiments, and Dehumanization. Evil in Auschwitz was not confined to the gas chambers. It also wore a white coat. Men who had sworn an oath to heal became architects of human suffering. SS doctors were not bystanders in the camp. They were central to its operation, providing a thin veil of legitimacy to a system designed for death. Selections on the ramp were their most visible role. When trains screeched to a halt and the cattle cars swung open, it was often physicians who decided the fate of thousands. Joseph Mengele, known to prisoners as the Angel of Death, stood poised in his immaculate uniform. With the flick of a wrist, he sent one group to labor and another to the gas. The gestures were casual, almost bureaucratic, but each wave of his hand was a death sentence. These decisions were not medical in any real sense. They were logistical calculations. Who appeared strong enough to endure grueling work? Who was too weak, too old, too young? Yet, the presence of doctors lent a grotesque credibility to the process. Victims saw the white coats and believed there might be care at the end of the line. Instead, they were being sorted like livestock. Inside the camp, medicine itself became a weapon. Prisoners were reduced to experimental material. The barracks and makeshift clinics of Auschwitz doubled as laboratories, where science was stripped of compassion and turned into cruelty. Sterilization experiments were conducted to find mass methods of preventing whole populations from reproducing. Chemicals were injected into wombs. Radiation was applied to reproductive organs. The goal was not healing, but eradication. Other experiments were equally horrifying. Prisoners were deliberately wounded and infections were introduced to study disease progression. Open wounds were packed with dirt or glass to mimic battlefield conditions. Subjects were denied pain relief, their agony considered part of the data. In other trials, chemicals were injected directly into veins to test new drugs. Some collapsed instantly. Others lingered in agony. Doctors exposed men and women to extremes of cold, plunging them into icy water or leaving them naked outdoors in the freezing night. They measured the time it took for the body to fail, noting vital signs until the heart stopped. These were not isolated acts of madness. They were carefully logged, observed, and documented in neat handwriting. The structure of science remained, but the soul of science was gone. Mengele's obsession with twins was perhaps the most notorious. To him, they were living test subjects, perfect for exploring genetic theories of heredity and racial superiority. Dozens of pairs were housed in special barracks. Each day brought endless examinations. Needles plunged into spines, chemicals injected into eyes in attempts to change their color. Blood drawn until children fainted. One twin might be killed so the other could be dissected for comparison. Survivors spoke of Mengele's polite manner, his almost charming smile, even as he orchestrated their torment. To the children, he was a paradox, both a figure of fascination and a bringer of unimaginable pain. To the Nazis, none of this was crime. It was research. In their warped ideology, Auschwitz became a laboratory for the human race itself, where pseudo-scientific theories of superiority were tested using living bodies as data points. Every experiment was framed as a contribution to knowledge, to medicine, to the future of the Reich. But behind the language of progress lay only brutality. The use of medicine in Auschwitz shows how profoundly science can be corrupted when stripped of ethics. The trappings of healing, clinics, doctors, laboratories, were twisted into instruments of death. The white coat, once a symbol of care, became a disguise for cruelty. This was not random violence. It was cruelty engineered, rationalized, and systematized. Data was logged, procedures were repeated, results were analyzed. Auschwitz demonstrated not only how far hatred could go, but how easily the tools of science could be bent toward destruction when morality is abandoned. And so, in the sterile glow of laboratory lamps and the cold gaze of doctors' eyes, thousands more lives were extinguished. One injection, one incision, one experiment at a time. Chapter 5. Collapse and Reckoning, Liberation and Trials. By late 1944, the Nazi killing machine was beginning to break down. The Red Army was advancing rapidly from the east, Allied forces pressed in from the west, and German supply lines collapsed under constant bombardment. Yet, even in these final months, Auschwitz continued its deadly work with staggering intensity. In the summer of 1944, nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to the camp. Most were killed within hours of arrival. The machinery of death still functioned, even as the Reich itself was crumbling. As Soviet forces drew closer in January 1945, the SS began a frantic effort to erase the evidence. Crematoria were dynamited, files were burned, and orders went out to evacuate tens of thousands of prisoners. These evacuations became the infamous death marches. Prisoners, skeletal and starving, were forced to walk for miles in the snow, barefoot and without food. Anyone who collapsed was shot on the roadside. Thousands died in those frozen landscapes before ever seeing liberation. On January 27, 1945, the first Soviet troops entered Auschwitz. What they encountered was beyond imagination. Barbed wire still humming with electricity, skeletal figures barely clinging to life, and storehouses filled with the possessions of the dead. Piles of shoes, eyeglasses, human hair, children's toys, mute evidence of a crime so vast it defied comprehension. The survivors, too weak even to celebrate, greeted their liberators with a silence born of exhaustion and trauma. Auschwitz was not just captured, it was revealed. The world could no longer deny the design of genocide. After the war, justice struggled to address the enormity of the crimes. At the Nuremberg trials, Rudolf Höss, the camp's commandant, described the extermination process in chillingly bureaucratic detail. He spoke of Zyklon B as though it were an industrial tool of crematoria capacities, as if they were factory machines. His testimony revealed the true nature of Auschwitz, not chaotic hatred, but calculated, engineered destruction. Other perpetrators also faced judgment. SS doctors, who had turned science into torture, were tried for their experiments. Industrialists, who profited from slave labor, sat in courtrooms beside officers in black uniforms. Some were executed, others sentenced to prison. Yet many escaped accountability, blending back into civilian life in post-war Europe. The reckoning, though historic, was never complete. Auschwitz itself, however, remained. Its barracks, crematoria ruins, and the Iron Gate marked Arbeit macht frei, were preserved. Today, millions of visitors walk its grounds, past mountains of suitcases, piles of children's shoes, and photographs of the victims. The site speaks without words. It is a place where design met destruction, where technology and planning were weaponized against humanity itself. The collapse of Auschwitz marked not only the end of a camp, but the unmasking of an idea. That mass murder could be engineered with precision, disguised as efficiency, and carried out under the banner of progress. Its ruins endure as a warning, proof of how far cruelty can go when cloaked in order. Auschwitz was not madness, it was method. Every fence, every barrack, every selection was part of a system engineered for evil. It stands as proof that the tools of civilization, architecture, science, bureaucracy, can be twisted into instruments of death. To walk through Auschwitz today is to confront the terrifying question: if design and intelligence can build such a place, what prevents it from happening again? Memory is the only safeguard. The blueprint of Auschwitz must remain visible, not to glorify its architects, but to expose their work as a warning etched forever in human history.